Welcome back. Now, as the United States prepares to impose a 25% tariff on all Malaysian exports starting August 1st, concerns are mounting over how this will impact trade, industry and economic growth. With negotiations still ongoing, Malaysia is now charting its strategic response, balancing national interest, economic resilience and diplomatic ties. Now, to shed light on the implications and possible paths forward, economist Dr. Geoffrey Williams joins me via Zoom from the Federal Capital. Doc, thanks for joining us. Now, I'd like to start here. How significant is the 25% blanket tariff imposed by the US on all Malaysian exports from the 1st of August up?
Well, I think to understand how significant it is, we need to look at the size of the trade that Malaysia is doing with the United States in terms of exports in particular. The United States is Malaysia's second largest export market, and last year, 2024, the total amount of exports from Malaysia to the US was about 200 billion ringgit. So if we have these tariffs imposed, and let's say the effect of that would be to reduce Malaysian exports to the US by 10%, that would be a loss of around 20 billion ringgit to the Malaysian economy, which is more than the government spends on the whole of the universities and higher education system. And it's about half as much again as the government spends on social welfare through STR SARA, which is about 13 billion. So it is a very large amount of money if the impact is across all of the trade, the export trade that Malaysia does with the US.
Now, Doc, which Malaysian industries are likely to feel the brunt of this tariff hike, and how might it affect jobs and overall export performance?
Well, Malaysia's biggest exports to the United States are electrical and electronics. About half of that is semiconductors, and so far semiconductors have been exempted from these tariff arrangements. So if that continues, the impact on the semiconductor sector shouldn't be too big, but there will be an impact across all of the other exports, and that includes electrical and electronics, which are non-semiconductor based, and also it's industrial intermediate products that are the largest proportion of exports from Malaysia to the US. Some of Malaysia's traditional exports, like palm oil, are actually not affected at all, really, because the United States doesn't import very much Malaysian palm oil. But it really is manufacturers and semi-manufactured products and electrical and electronics, excluding the semiconductors.
Now, that's good to hear that at least the semiconductors portion is not affected at this point of time. Now, Malaysia is still negotiating with the US and has until the 1st of August before the tariff is enforced. What kind of concessions or trade-offs do you think Malaysia might consider, and what are the risks involved?
The risks involved of not getting a deal are, as I mentioned at the beginning, which is the potential loss in export business. And that is measured in tens of billions of ringgit. So there is a huge risk of not getting a good deal. And that means removing most of those reciprocal tariffs, the 25% reciprocal tariffs, if not hoping to remove all of them. The type of concessions that can be done, they range from removing tariffs and non-tariff barriers on things that don't really matter to Malaysia, small things that can be changed very quickly, all the way through to my preferred option, which is basically to remove all of the tariffs and all of the non-tariff barriers, because Malaysia only imposes an average tariff on US imports of around 5.6%. So if you just removed all of that and allowed the market to decide, allowed consumers to decide whether they want to buy American products or not, allowed businesses to decide whether they want to buy American products or not. If you were to go down that route, which I understand that's a very big step, but if you were to go down that route, you could get rid of all of the reciprocal tariffs, and that would basically place the trade arrangements in the hands of the people who are doing the trade, which is the businesses and the consumers.
Now, thanks for that, Doc. Now, Vietnam, let's look at that, managed to negotiate a lower 20% tariff rate. Is there a realistic chance Malaysia could secure a similar deal, or are the conditions different in our case?
There is a real chance that Malaysia can get a deal. I think the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was here in the last few days, and he was very positive about the possibility of win-win negotiations. So there is a good chance, even though there's only about 3 weeks left. In the case of Vietnam, I think the issues are different because Vietnam has quite a lot of Chinese businesses which are located into Vietnam and which are using Vietnam as a base in order to produce products which they then sell to the United States. That's why Vietnam still has this higher 20% tariff. In the case of Malaysia, we don't have that so much. And so it would be possible for Malaysia, in principle, to have a much bigger reduction in the reciprocal tariffs. And that can be done, as I mentioned, through removing Malaysian tariffs on US products, but also by signaling better and closer coordination. In fact, even today, MITI has announced that they will be taking steps to regulate US chips, US microchips coming through Malaysia to make sure that they're not redirected into China. And so that type of regulatory cooperation will help the relationship between Malaysia and the United States, and that will help to build a relationship of trust, which can reduce the overall tariffs.
Now, some analysts suggest ASEAN might pivot more towards China and India. What's your view on this possible realignment of trade relationships?
Realignment of trade relationships takes a very long time. It's not something that can be done quickly. You need to build business relationships, you need to build supply chain relationships, and also you need to deal with reciprocal tariff and non-tariff relationships as well. Don't imagine that the United States are the only country that has tariffs and non-tariff issues. Every country has these issues. So whilst there might be some benefit for everybody in realigning trade flows, that's not something that will happen quickly. It certainly will not happen as a consequence of these reciprocal tariff arrangements. It will be something that will take many years, if not decades, to have a very big impact on Malaysian trade flows.
Now, Doc, could these unilateral tariffs weaken the US's economic credibility in Southeast Asia? And how should Malaysia balance maintaining ties with the US while deepening ties with other partners?
Well, I think what's been going on with these tariff issues has actually strengthened trade negotiations and trade relations between the United States and countries around the world. Because what it's done is it's made absolutely clear that the US is serious about reordering the international trade arrangements. And these have caused more than 100 countries have been involved in direct trade negotiations with the US, of course, including countries here in Southeast Asia, and Malaysia is part of that. And that will continue. And Secretary of State Rubio said very clearly that he considers that Southeast Asia, ASEAN, is a very important strategic partner of the United States now, and it will continue to be in the future. So that's not going to change, except to be improved, in my view.
Now, CIMB has warned of a potential downgrade in Malaysia's GDP growth if a better deal isn't secured. How vulnerable is our economic outlook to these external shocks in the second half of 2025, Doc?
I think that there is a consensus that the earlier optimism at the beginning of the year, which is between sort of 4.5% to 5.5% growth for the year as a whole, that was good at the time, but given the circumstances now, it is likely that the growth forecast will be downgraded perhaps to around 4 to 5%, which is actually within the normal growth range Now, it's not the case that this is all to do with the tariffs, but given that other indicators, domestic demand and so on, are really actually quite strong, we can be very clear that this downgrade in economic growth is very much affected by the tariffs. And that means that it's very important to get a good deal by August the 1st, because if you don't get a deal, you risk losing that 20 billion in trade, and that will be the loss to economic growth, and that's where you will get the economic growth downturn. So it's very important to have this this agreement reached by that time.
Now, you've highlighted that that's a massive potential loss if we don't find a solution at the negotiating table. Now, lastly, Doc, do you think ASEAN should respond collectively to this US trade action, or is bilateral negotiation the only viable route for countries like Malaysia?
I think there are some areas where ASEAN can act collectively, for example, on the regulation of transshipment of microchips from the US, AI technology from the US through ASEAN and then into China, for example. ASEAN as a whole can coordinate around that type of regulatory strengthening. But I think in terms of general trade, each country is very different. And each country has its own agenda, and each country will have to negotiate on a bilateral basis. So mostly, Malaysia will have to negotiate bilaterally with the US, not through ASEAN, in my view. Although on regulatory cooperation, yes, there is a possibility for Malaysia to lead ASEAN in order to get ASEAN-wide response to that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Geoffrey Williams, for your time. Hopefully, Malaysia will be able to secure a better tariff rate through negotiations before August 1st. Dr. Geoffrey Williams, founder and director of Williams Business Consultancy, on Malaysia charting its response to the current 25% tariff. Now, more updates coming up shortly. This is The World on Bernama TV. Stay tuned.